Hi there. Entertainment Weekly and Deadline are reporting that HBO's new leadership is on the verge of ordering a second prequel pilot for Game of Thrones on a different era entirely. The Dance of the Dragons, the great civil war between two rival branches of House Targaryen that occurred about 170 years before the War of the Five Kings that featured in Game of Thrones. It was the most devastating war in the history of Westeros, and the War of the Five Kings is only just beginning to approach its level of destruction, given that it was the only major war in Westeros since, in which both sides had dragons. The story begins at the apex of the Targaryen dynasty, about 130 years after Aegon's conquest and the forging of the Iron Throne. And after initial rebellions and straightening things out, there has been a golden age of peace for the past 80 years. But it comes to an end when old King Viserys I dies, sparking a succession crisis between his oldest child and designated heir, his daughter Rhaenyra, and Viserys' second child but oldest son, Aegon II. The great houses of the Seven Kingdoms then split between them in the war, with the Starks, Tullys, Arryns, Greyjoys, and Velaryons siding with Rhaenyra, but the Lannisters, Baratheons, and Hightowers siding with Aegon II. If that sounds a little imbalanced, it actually isn't. This touches on the question of why the richest houses in all of Westeros don't automatically rule the entire realm. Aegon II's faction, nicknamed the Greens, actually control most of the major cities, wealth, and population. The odds are actually stacked against Rhaenyra. Even though it seems like there's more great houses, he controls the wealthiest ones. And the most populous ones, so he has the largest land armies. Rhaenyra's faction, who are nicknamed the Blacks, hold a lot of territory, but it's less populous and less wealthy. Like the North doesn't have much in it compared to the Reach or the Westerlands. And her faction does control more of the fleets and has a few more dragons. But it's stacked against her at first, and it goes back and forth. Particularly if you haven't heard of the Hightowers and Velaryons, and you know this from the TV show only, they haven't been mentioned in live-action episodes by name, only in the animated featurettes. The Hightowers actually rule Old Town, which we did briefly see, and they're pretty important. Margaery and Loras Tyrell's mother was a Hightower. They rule Old Town. It's the second city of Westeros. It's only slightly smaller than King's Landing. It's the headquarters of the Maesters, and at the time of this prequel, it was also the headquarters of the Faith of the Seven, before it moved to King's Landing. Meanwhile, the Velaryons They were a minor noble family from Valyria that followed the Targaryens to Westeros right before the Doom destroyed their homeland, and they came to be the family in charge of the Targaryens' royal fleets. They're the sea version of the Targaryens without dragons. They have ships instead of dragons. So they became the hereditary admirals for their Targaryen cousins over the royal fleet. Meanwhile, Aegon II's mother is actually Alicent Hightower, which is why they're his chief supporters, through blood, while through intermarriage, the Velaryons are Rhaenyra's chief supporters. So it's the Hightower faction versus the Velaryon faction of the Targaryens. And the result of this is a split between the great houses and devastating civil war unlike anything ever seen in Westeros, because at the time, there were 20 living dragons. This is the most dragons they ever had, and it's why the dragons that got their numbers so badly reduced they went extinct within a generation. Now, if you're going to worry about CGI budget in the comments here, just think about it. Consider that Game of Thrones had 3 major storylines split between the War of the Five Kings and the Seven Kingdoms, Daenerys and her dragons in Essos, and the threat of the White Walkers and the lands beyond the Wall. It was like 3 TV series rolled up into one in seasons 2 and 3. This prequel entirely focuses on one big storyline in Westeros involving dragons. It's sort of like if they combined the Daenerys story into Westeros from the beginning, sort of like how Season 7 went, but leaving out anything with the Night's Watch and the Wall. That wouldn't be in it. So the White Walkers are not in this. Consider that all of that special effects budget that was used on armies of zombies in Game of Thrones, or even just the special effects stuff of dealing with direwolves, live actor wolves that had to be digitally scaled up into direwolves, which was a nightmare to deal with. All that CGI budget for why are there direwolves in this episode was spread thin between the direwolves, the zombies, and the dragons. All of the CGI budget would be focused purely on the dragons in this. There aren't any zombie hordes. So you can see that working. Just if you've read the prequel novella it's based on, if they plan it out. They don't have literally all 20 on screen at the same time. The biggest fights involve 3 at a time. But more on that in coming months of exactly what are they going to do, where are they going to cut corners. I think you could fit all this on TV at the budget they had for like Game of Thrones Season 6. You could easily fit this on screen, just the way it plays out. But we'll address that as we get news. What is the current news? What was actually announced about this second pilot? Well, they didn't officially order it yet. We're just hearing public rumblings from major news outlets like Entertainment Weekly, which is, they have an in with them, and Deadline, saying that a pilot order is imminent, that an official announcement is imminent. And on this point, I want to clear something up as best I can. Many news sites are just copying the original, and it's turning into the telephone game where they're getting details wrong. And they're getting confused and saying they're making the Targaryen conquest. When I actually first saw this, it was in a major publication that will remain nameless, but not a tiny one, who thought it was the Targaryen conquest, which got me all confused until I sat down and read what Deadline said. That no, they're not doing conquest, they're doing dance. The mistake comes from all this lazy reporting by, when you read an article and you can tell this person doesn't even know what Fire and Blood is, even though it was like on the New York Times bestsellers list for months this past year. Well, Fire and Blood is part 1 of a planned 2-part history of the 300-year reign of the Targaryen dynasty. So it's an in-universe history book covering 300 years, and he had to split it into 2 volumes. This is part 1. It's still a very long book, and it covers 150 years of history, multiple generations. There are about 4 major prequel eras in it, which if you turn them into 7 to 8 year TV shows, there's like 2 massive prequel TV shows in this book alone. But they could never be fit. 150 years in one TV show, you wouldn't want to do that. Martin said Fire and Blood Part 1 has about 20 novels worth of material in it if he ever fully narrativized it. So there's like, in his estimation, 20 TV seasons worth of material in it, depending on how you want to cut that up. Do you want 5 shows that are 4 years each, or 2 shows that are 10 years each, So whatever they do, but it's not just one thing from Fire and Blood. And the problem is that the text blurb on the back cover of Fire and Blood says that it is, quote, set 300 years before Game of Thrones. And yeah, that's true for the starting point. And it covers multiple generations after that, advancing through history. The dance was 130 years after the beginning of the book, but still 170 years ago. So due to the way the Deadline article that broke the story phrased it, if you check Deadline, they do actually say it's going to be focused on the dance. But the way they tried to introduce describing it's based on Fire and Blood, they kind of said it in such an awkward way that they reposted the description of Fire and Blood, where it's just the blurb that set 300 years ago. Other news sites then started running with that of, wait, they're saying it's set 300 years ago, because they were skimming the original announcement. 300 years ago, this must be on the Targaryen conquest and the forging of the Iron Throne. And, well, this is a telephone game at work, getting the rumored announcement all distorted. But Entertainment Weekly's report on it, which, we know James Hibbert has an in with people who are working close to production, with leak sources, he firmly said it is on the Dance of the Dragons. As did the Deadline article, plus Westeros.org itself, on their newsfeed, posted a big news post, this is on the Dance of the Dragons. We were even hearing rumblings of this when we were with Martin at Worldcon in Ireland, which was just a week or two ago, that there's a big announcement coming, and we got the feeling it was about the dance, not the conquest. So if Deadline, Entertainment Weekly, and Westeros.org are all wrong, I'm wrong as well. But by that point, that's not our fault. This was a really poorly phrased wording if it was. But no, there's other rumors I've heard that they wanted to do the dance before they did the conquest because it's better suited to TV. I agree, it's more of a cohesive narrative. So you might be seeing a few news sites misreporting this because they don't know what Fire and Blood is, or that it contains outlines for more than one prequel show, and they're skipping to the middle to get to the best one. Because you can do that because it's coming off an 80-year period of peace. You can just jump into that without really needing to go over the conquest again. Now, in that comparison, by the numbers, the Dance of the Dragons has by far the most book material to draw from in terms of the word count that Martin wrote for these eras in Fire and Blood, which were previously individually released prequel novellas that he expanded and worked into it. He originally intended them to be sidebars in World of Ice and Fire, but as he was writing these prequel novellas in order from the conquest through the dance, he started going into more detail as he went. So even though the conquest is a full prequel era, because he did it first, he only wrote 10,000 words on it, but as he was getting more confident, getting in the feel of writing prequel stuff, by the time he got to the chapter on the Dance of the Dragons, it was 60,000 words long. So he just wrote so much more on it. There's a lot more narrative and dialogue in it compared to the relatively thinner outlines for the other stuff. And this isn't even counting all the lead-up chapters to both these eras, or the aftermath chapters to both of them. But whatever, so 60,000 compared to 10,000, there's a lot more material to draw on. So, also, just reading it, you realize how well the Dance of the Dragons would comparatively work as a TV show. It's got two sides fighting for the Iron Throne in the Seven Kingdoms, no side stories following Jon Snow at the Wall or Daenerys and Essos. And it's actually a lot easier to follow than the so-called War of the Five Kings. I mean, in Season 2 of Game of Thrones, you got the War of the Five Kings. People had to keep track of 5 different factions in the Seven Kingdoms. Joffrey and the Lannisters, Robb Stark's faction, Stannis' faction, Renly's faction, and now the Greyjoys is their own faction. And on top of that, Dany and Essos and Jon at the Wall. In contrast, the Targaryen conquest, while it wouldn't have like Essos or Wall storylines, Targaryen conquest is about the Targaryens invading and conquering what were, at the time, 7 different independent kingdoms. And that can work as a TV show. Case in point, they made that really nice 40-minute animated movie about it, the motion comic for the Season 7 Blu-rays. And you see, this works as a narrative because the Targaryens are the main characters, but it's a bit more episodic because they're not fighting all of Westeros. It's first they fight the Stormlands, then they fight the Ironborn, then they fight the Lannisters, then they face the Starks. But they're not this cohesive opposing faction. They're these 7 other kingdoms. I think it works as a story. It's just a little more episodic. And the Iron Throne hasn't been built yet versus, hey, it's a succession crisis. There's 2 sides fighting for it. You can dive right into that. So I'm not saying that Conquest is incohesive. It's just that the Dance of the Dragons is really streamlined. 2 sides fighting in the 7 kingdoms, nothing else. Well, things get more complicated by what would be Season 4 or 5 of that, but there's their various betrayals and stuff, but it progresses naturally to that. Relatively succinct. I mean, you tell me in the comments here, if any, when we first sat down to read the prequel novella on this in 2013, a year before World of Ice and Fire was printed, you just finished The Princess and the Queen on the Dance of the Dragons, you finished that novella and go, wow, this should be a TV show. It's well suited to being a TV show, where there's other prequel eras like the new material on King Jaehaerys, which spans 50 years, and it'll be difficult to fit that into a TV format. I wouldn't even call that an era as such. You'd make one-shots for that or something. But the Dance of the Dragons, it feels like this is cinematic. This could cohesively be a TV show without too many subplots that are difficult to put in 1 hour of television. Moving on. This is the important stuff on the business side of things, behind the scenes, new info. Everything else is for all you new people, but this is what we know and what we don't. The potential showrunner for this Dance of the Dragons series was revealed in this news break. Ryan Condal from USA's Colony Alien Invasion show, who has made several convention panel appearances with George R. R. Martin in the past, in Santa Fe and at other events, so they know each other. Now, for those of you that have been following prequel news on here and in other channels, that should raise some eyebrows. Ryan Condal isn't one of the 5 potential showrunners that were first announced back in summer of 2018, which consisted of Jane Goldman, Max Borenstein, Carly Ray, Brian Helgeland, and Brian Cogman. Now, earlier this spring, Cogman announced that he'd left to work as a story consultant on Amazon's new Lord of the Rings prequel show. But this news break today also announced that Ryan Condal is specifically taking over the prequel era that Cogman was initially writing for. He's taking over because Cogman left. So now we know with confirmation that Brian Cogman's pitch was actually the Dance of the Dragons. I was wrong. I thought it was something else. This threw me for the past year because, well, it makes sense how it threw me if you break down the order it happened and it was a little confusing. 4 potential showrunners were announced around May 2018, but then Cogman was announced a month later in June. Now, even in May, Martin said, a 5th idea is on the way. We're just hashing out contract specifics. The ink is drying. And at the time, I assumed that Cogman's pitch was formalized last because it was made last. It was announced last. And therefore probably wasn't one of the more important prequel eras. Like you would think the first ones pitched would be the Dance of the Targaryen Conquest. There's prequel novellas about them. Actually, it's incorrect. It was due to scheduling conflicts, which in retrospect is unsurprising because that's also why he left ultimately. Now, on my channel, I'm going to link this at the end. I have this earlier video where I talk about an extensive interview Cogman gave in May of 2019, just a few months back, with Vanity Fair, in which he explained that his pitch was rejected because he was still busy working on Season 8 of Game of Thrones, so he didn't have time to devote his full attention to it. Well, you should have realized that before you accepted the position, but he was so busy working on Season 8, he couldn't put together a good pitch, a thorough one that was solid. Even though this is a good prequel era, he didn't have time to punch it up well for scripting. So being busy with scheduling for other projects, writing the final season, then the Lord of the Rings stuff, that's why his was the last one formalized. Just because he was really busy at the time working on Season 8, even though it was one of the prime prequel ideas you can have. So I can see how the confusion started and it was announced out of order like that. But, critically, in that interview with Vanity Fair this past May, he actually said that it was at a dinner meeting a full year before, in May 2018, like a week or two before that announcement. He was at a dinner meeting with Martin and also Benioff and Weiss, and that it was at that meeting that Martin actually handpicked him to be showrunner on his prequel pitch. So we knew whatever he did, Cogman actually didn't pick. Martin picked it for him. So Cogman didn't ask to do the Dance of the Dragons. Martin assigned it to him. And this sort of makes sense on paper, really. He's the only one staff writer on Game of Thrones, other than the showrunners who are leaving. And the dance is probably the biggest and most important prequel idea, so in theory, they'd want their most experienced guy on it. I can see how that would happen. In practice, though, well, many of you have already seen my video clips. We have lost all faith in Brian Cogman. He's a yes man, and he doesn't really know how screenwriting works, even though he's a pleasant and jovial human being in person. When you see panel videos of him engaged in conversation about, he doesn't know how screenwriting works, and don't take my word for it. I have these clips that you look at the comments, everyone's shocked by them, where he just repeats what Benioff told him screenwriting is, which is the blind leading the blind, that doesn't have a screenwriting degree, and I have these clips on my channel of him saying verbatim, and this is without exaggeration, quote, "We are capable of writing scenes in which a character doesn't speak, but we know the actor so well that we're capable of writing the subtext in the script so the actors can just convey all that info with their faces, which is gibberish." So if you're wondering why there was so much staring in the end of Season 8 with no dialogue, or why their scripts, when people saw the Season 8 script come out, it's just filled with like paragraph-long descriptions of their inner mental thoughts, because that's what they have openly stated on video they truly think screenwriting is. They think that's how screenwriting works. Actors can convey all this information with their nonverbal performance. And that's you riding their coattails for Emmy Awards. That just because a character can stare really hard doesn't mean we can make sense of coherently why they're doing these things. But for whatever reason, Cogman left for other stuff because of Lord of the Rings. It's water under the bridge. Whatever the reason, we don't have to deal with Cogman now. Now, I've seen a few people concerned that the new guy, Ryan Condal, will be, quote, finishing up Cogman's pitch, and are worried about that. No, let me dispel that immediately. It is a blank slate. New writers usually totally rework stuff, and they stated he would be taking a fresh take on that prequel era. He's not working with anything Cogman did. Martin said it at the time when Cogman left, without specifying what Cogman was working on. He said his pitch idea was on a specific prequel era from the books, so Cogman leaving doesn't mean that era will never get made. It just means Cogman won't do it. I mean, like, Martin has said they're not doing Robert's Rebellion as a prequel now. But if Cogman had pitched a Robert's Rebellion series and then had left due to a scheduling conflict, that doesn't mean that the very idea of a Robert's Rebellion prequel would never happen. No, it's a defined historical era from the books. Same with the Dance of the Dragon. So this is nothing from Cogman is going into this. It is a fresh start with someone else taking a stab at one of the major prequel eras, which has prequel novellas devoted to it, the Dance of the Dragons. Also, I must say, saying their names out loud like this, I'm just realizing it's mildly confusing and funny that, their names are similar. Brian Cogman was replaced by Ryan Condal. So forgive me if I trip over that. They're both Ryan vowels and a K sound. And no, it's not a fake pen name that Brian Cogman is passing himself off as Ryan Condal. Ryan Condal is a public figure who's worked on other TV shows before, like that Colony show. It's just their names are kind of similar, but whatever. Now, this does lead to a question I've been trying to figure out. What the heck were the 5 prequel pitches? We know they weren't Robert's Rebellion or the Tales of Dunk and Egg, but Martin said they weren't. You see, I assumed Cogman was doing one of the lower priority ones because he was announced last. So I thought, in my past video, I got this whole rant about I think he's doing Young Tywin and the Rain Rebellion, which might be one of the pitches they were doing. I think he could do that as a one-shot. But it turns out, no, he was doing Dance of the Dragons, which at the time I assumed Carly Rae was doing, based on some stray comments she made on Twitter, which turned out to be nothing. So we're reasonably sure what the first 4 ideas are, and I think Young Tywin is quite probably a 5th idea, but that's just guesswork of what could possibly be the 5th one, but I'll get to that. So, if you've been following my channel and news on this, this raises questions about the other prequel pilots currently in contention.